Okay. And my guest for this show was Lawrence Wilkerson. He was the Chief of Staff for Secretary of State Colin Powell, and he's a distinguished adjunct professor of government and public policy at the College of William and Mary. And we just did an extensive 1-hour interview, but we hit a topic that I just feel you said something really significant, and then we started getting into it off the recording, and I wanted to get back on it. You talked about how secretaries of state tend to lean towards wanting to go to war, and explain, how does that happen?
I think it's a phenomenon particularly of the post-World War II era. Once we had passed the 1947 National Security Act and created the National Security Council, which brings together by statutory responsibility the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense and a few others, but those two principal members of the cabinet in a confrontational atmosphere in front of the president, if that's what the president allows, and more often than not they do, then you get this competition. And the competition usually is between the individual who, if he commits military forces to combat, is going to have the most responsibility for it and the most angst about it, because the men and women dying or coming back horribly wounded or post-traumatic stress or whatever belong to him or her.
And the power, though, too, right?
Yeah, and the power, too. Whereas on the other side, Powell used to call it, when he'd refer to himself as chairman, he would say to the media, yeah, I'm a reluctant warrior. And that characterizes the secretaries of defense, usually, not always. Rumsfeld was an exception. Cheney was an exception. Secretaries of State, on the other hand, have no dog in the fight. At best, their responsibility is going to be to pick up the pieces after the military withdraws, which isn't always a successful story for our country either.
But sometimes not a story at all in the case of Iraq.
Exactly. But the tendency to want to just say, okay, let's fix it, because the other guy and his men and women will have to fix it. And we can fix it best by smacking it, okay? At Secretary of State level is high, the propensity for wanting to do that. Just examine John Foster Dulles, examine George Shultz, examine even Alexander Haig once he moved over to Mufti and was Secretary of State. Look at Madeleine Albright, look at Hillary Clinton. We saw he died talking about Gaddafi. They tend to be what we military types call warmongers. I can't tell you how many secretaries of state, as a captain, major, lieutenant colonel, and colonel, I excoriated in a 30-year military career.
And what would you excoriate them for?
Well, why did we do this? And then you would find out that the principal arguer for this, whatever it might be, hot war, conflict, in the National Security Council was the Secretary of State, not your boss, the Secretary of Defense. And you find that out through a number of ways. I had the good fortune from the time I was a major on to work for 4 stars. I worked for 2 prospective and then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and directly for 1 chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Powell. So I was very early on in what you might call the top echelons of power management in Washington. And so I got to see this up close and personal. Powell once said to me, don't bring any more West Point lieutenants down here to my office. And I said, what's the problem, General? And he said, because we don't want to expose these lieutenants when they're just starting their career to what goes on here. There was a lot of truth in what Powell said.
What was going on that you didn't want to expose them to?
You're a young lieutenant and you think you're going abroad to fight for God and country, mother, apple pie, the security of America, democracy, freedom, and all that. That's all bullshit. You're going abroad to fight for American commerce at best. And at worst, you're going abroad to fight for some guy's fricking attitude or his fears or her interpretation of events. Look at Hillary's interpretation of Libya. It was abysmal. It was downright stupid. And even if you look at the commercial interests involved of France and Britain in particular, and say, well, we owe Britain something for having been with us in the first Iraq war, and you try to, put those rationales out on the table, they fade quickly beside the chaos you create, which is still there in Libya. We uncovered the greatest arms cache in North Africa. There were some 15,000 shoulder-fired missiles there. The CIA immediately put a $5,000 bounty on each and every one of them and said $5,000 to any man who presents me with one. Well, where did they go? They went to ISIS. They went to Al-Qaeda. They went all over the Levant for any terrorists who wanted to use them. And that's just the top of the lot, so to speak. All kinds of small arms ammunition, 50 caliber machine guns, 30 caliber, all manner of arms went out all over North Africa. You could say, well, that's what we wanted because we wanted to make Africa command. We did, President Obama. And we wanted to take over Africa with the military for the first time in our history. We now address Africa, not with diplomats, not with finance and economic aid. We address it with the military. That's where the predominant number of our military right now fighting terrorists are. We just got the leader of Kenya to allow us to use drones in Kenya. There are 9 countries that we're flying across the borders of, each of which we're not constitutionally at war, in which we're killing people from time to time. This is insane.
Africa? Really?
Yes.
Nobody's talking about that.
No one, remember the people who died in Niger, and everybody went, ooh, why are we in Niger? We're in other places like Mali, Djibouti, Kenya, Somalia also.
So now my impression is that Trump has no interest in soft power. He's into using money and weapons and hard power to get things done. But the State Department is about soft power. And how do we get to the point where we're bringing in these secretaries of state? I mean, now I'm thinking that probably having Colin Powell as a military man going into diplomacy, he was probably more able to say no to war and no to violent acts than a civilian would be.
Absolutely. His most deft handling of a crisis was in April of 2001 when we had an EP-3, a naval reconnaissance aircraft that strayed a little too close to Hainan Island, a very critical military conglomeration for China. And an F-8 pilot, Chinese jet pilot, came up, essentially impacted the aircraft, and he crashed and it killed him. He was one of their top aces, and the EP-3 was forced to do a crash landing on Hainan Island with all kinds of secure gear on it. And Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, Vice President and Secretary of Defense, respectively, wanted to use that as an excuse for an immediate commencement of a Cold War with China. Powell, not even paying any attention, got on his cell phone and called Chen Chi-chen, who was touring South America with the Chinese leadership group at that time, apprised him of the crisis. And if I can believe Powell, Chen Chi-chen didn't even know about it. Powell was alerting him to the crisis, worked the crisis to the point where he could go to Bush and say, if you'll dispatch someone to China of requisite rank, we'll get that airplane back and we'll get the 24 people on board back, more important than the airplane, and we won't have a crisis. Bush was smart enough to realize Powell had the thing well in hand. And so we did it, sent Joe Proer, Admiral Joe Proer, former ambassador to China and 4-star Navy admiral. He worked out the deal. We got the plane coming back. We got the people back immediately. And then Powell told Rumsfeld through the National Security Advisor, Condi Rice, if you'll send someone to China of similar rank, you can get the airplane back. Well, Rumsfeld decided he would do all he could to, embarrass China. So he sent a Navy lieutenant. Well, the Chinese cut the airplane up in pieces and sent it back cash on delivery. But Powell averted a major crisis with our principal antagonist, if you will, competitor at least, in the world at that time. And he did it on his cell phone. And he did it quickly, and he did it through diplomacy. And he knew he was defying his vice president and his Secretary of Defense compatriot. But I think he also knew that the president, George W. Bush, understood that Powell had the China portfolio because George W. Bush knew how important China was to Walmart and their, corporate America, and therefore the electorate. And so Bush was not about to let Cheney and Rumsfeld perturbate the relationship with China.
So you've got Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense,
Right.
and you've got Colin Powell as the Secretary of State. And what's the balance of power between them? How does that usually work?
It shifted dramatically against Powell because Cheney and Rumsfeld learned quickly that Dr. Rice was not sufficient power to discipline the decision-making process, so they ran circles around her. And they also learned that the president was more like to agree with them, initially at least, than with Powell. In a metaphor that I'll never forget, Powell came back one day from a meeting in the Oval, and he put it this way, and it's perfect, I think. I use it in the book. He said to me, LW, Dick Cheney knows how to get knows how to get the president to pull out his .45 and start shooting. Pause. And I don't know how to get him to holster it again. And that summed up their relationship from that point on. Really summed it up, because anytime Cheney and Rumsfeld worked their way around Condi, and often they did it by simply stomping on her. There are a number of times when I'm told she was brought to tears, and got to the president and got him to make a decision for the use of force or whatever, the Iraq invasion being a case in point, that Powell couldn't talk him out of it. Or if he did talk him out of it, as he did one time with regard to North Korea, then Dick Cheney would come home from Wyoming, where he'd been fly fishing, go grab the president and talk the president into reversing Powell. So, it was impossible for Powell to deal with a triumvirate against him and no one to negotiate, because Condi decided early on, if I want to be Secretary of State in the second term, I can't defy these people, because more often than not, George W. Bush is going to agree with them. And if I want him to appoint me Secretary of State in the second term, which he subsequently did, then I've got to get closer to him and not make him angry by defying Rumsfeld and Cheney. So Powell had got one other thing working against you too. You got Karl Rove whispering in George W. Bush's ear about once a month, do you know that the most formidable political opponent you might have in 2004, if you run for re-election, is your Secretary of State? Mm. And you can't disabuse a president of that feeling. Powell tried to. He told him he had absolutely zero interest in running for president. He demonstrated it in 1995 when both parties were trying to recruit him. And he went to the Ramada in Alexandria and he said, I am not going to run for president. But you can't convince a sitting president that a man with 72% poll ratings isn't going to run against him.
What about now? What about Trump and him taking his gun out, putting it back in the holster? How's it compare?
I think Trump is, in a sense, reluctant to use military power. He's not reluctant to plus up the defense budget and get those soldiers on his side politically. He's not reluctant to threaten Venezuela. Oh my God, what a formidable force Venezuela is. He's not reluctant to holler at North Korea or holler at Iran. But I think he's very reluctant to get engaged in something that smacks of real commitment, death, pillage and plunder, lots of troops coming home bleeding and dying, and PTS and so forth, because his base in many respects voted for him because they said he would end these endless stupid wars. And that is one aspect of his base with which I agree.
Yeah, I can. Who cannot agree with? Well, I guess if you're in the business of selling munitions or services to the military, then you disagree.
If you're Lockheed Martin, you have to disagree because it's shareholder profit.
Yeah. So how do we get it so that we get secretaries of state that are not into war? How does that happen?
Presidents have to pick them. And that's tough. It's tough because the national security establishment, as President Obama was intimating, when he said there was a bias in this town toward war, he didn't just mean in the cabinet or in the agencies. He meant in the think tanks, in the universities, all over the establishment that calls itself the national security elite. You're defying all of them when you pick someone who is not want to go and use the military instrument.
So who advises the president on who to pick to become Secretary of State?
Well, ultimately, it's a personal decision, but it's advised by the Democratic National Committee or the Republican National Committee. It's advised by his other picks who are closer to him, perhaps. It's advised by his personal confidants and so forth. George Bush, if I'm to believe what permeated the administration afterwards, the first administration, basically went on Dick Cheney's recommendations. In some cases on his father's advice, in other cases on Brent Scowcroft's advice, his father's national security advisor. But mostly he went on his gut feelings after Cheney advised him. And there are some people who would tell you that Dick Cheney picked everybody in November of 2000 when the Supreme Court was still dealing with the election and gave Bush that slate, and Bush pretty much went with it.
Well, but that's the way it should be. I mean, as soon in November, Biden should have a whole slew of people figuring things out to do, who to appoint, what bills to go. And if Biden can manage to get the House and the Senate in the first 100 days, they should run and pass 100, 200 bills. They should have it already. The day they should hit the ground.
But I agree, but I don't think I'd let Kamala Harris do all the determining of who's going to serve me.
No, that is kind of laughable. Yeah. That's. But who doesn't?
Dick Cheney picked himself to be vice president. It's clear. I write about this. It's very clear. He picked himself to be vice president.
Well, I think that was widely known.
Yeah. He orchestrated that, but it's really a genius. Richard Haas called it bureaucratic entrepreneurship. Well, one of the chief entrepreneurs in bureaucraties in America is Dick Cheney.
And I don't think we really even know who is advising Joe Biden, who's helping him with his policy.
I know a few of them.
Oh, really? Who?
Yeah, I'd rather not say because I've been told I should keep my mouth shut.
Well, you mentioned.
I was working with Bernie to a certain extent. First time around, I was working with Bernie until I made some remarks about Israel in the New York Times, and Bernie cut me loose. Then the second time around, his chief of staff came to me and said, could you just talk to us about foreign policy and national security policy and the defense budget? I said, sure. I don't need my name in Klieg lights or anything. I'm glad to advise you, but I met a lot of the people that'll be in Biden's team too. So
you brought up Israel. What about when Colin Powell was the Secretary of State? What did you see behind the scenes with Israel back then?
I saw two real stark phenomena, developments, I guess you should say. One, I saw Bush tell Ariel Sharon in the Oval that our policy had not worked for 40 plus years. Therefore, there was going to be a new policy, and the new policy was, it's all to you. You got it. And as far as I'm concerned, your successor and his successor will have it. Because it hasn't worked, so you do what needs to be done.
That's all Sheldon Adelson wants.
And we'll back you up. And Powell, of course, was still working. He was still working the roadmap. He was still working the Middle East peace process. He was still meeting with Arafat in Ramallah. He was still giving press conferences in Sharm el-Sheikh and talking about, and meanwhile, back home, Dick Cheney was, sawing the limb that Powell walked out on off.
Wow. Yeah. So this goes back, way back.
And the president was a little bit duplicitous because he would tell Powell, yeah, go ahead and do it. Not with a lot of ardor in his voice, but yeah, go and do it. Go ahead. And then he just watched Cheney ruin it. Much the way Cheney ruined Powell coming out and saying after he talked with Hans Blix and after he knew the inspectors were going back into Iraq and the president had said, yes, let the inspectors go back into Iraq. And Dick Cheney goes out and gives a speech, incidentally, that no one had seen, no one had cleared. I don't even think the president himself had seen the speech. And he says, in essence, it won't make any difference if the inspectors go back. Saddam Hussein knows how to bump and cheat. The inspectors won't make any difference at all. Well, the president and Powell had just said the inspectors were going back, and if they, reported that there was nothing, and we believe them, that could be the end of the game. Dick wanted war.
Somehow, I don't think that kind of conniving and power gestures, we're going to see that from Kamala Harris.
I don't think so. Not with Joe. If anything, I learned about Biden. I'm not a particular fan of Joe Biden, but if I learned anything about him, it was through the constant phone calls from Powell as both chairman and Secretary of State. He didn't call Dick Lugar. When he was chairman, he called Sam Nunn, principally because he was chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee at the time. And when he was Secretary of State, Dick Lugar was the SFRC head at that time, at the beginning, till the Democrats took it. And then he still called Biden. Condi even chastised him from time to time. Why aren't you calling Dick? Dick calls me and says, you don't talk to him, but you talk to his partner, Joe. And Powell would say things like, well, Joe knows the issues.
What do you mean? Tell me more about that.
Well, anytime Powell would call and say, what's the sense of the Congress or the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on this Law of the Sea Treaty or on the Test Ban Treaty or whatever, what's the sense of the Congress on the war in Iraq? What's the sense of the Congress on Afghanistan now, whatever? You call and talk to Joe to get the sense of the Congress. He wouldn't talk to Lugar. He'd talk to Joe because he got better answers. He got answers, not necessarily answers that comported with his views, but he got answers that were studied, deliberate, intelligent, commonsensical, logical, and so forth. Whereas other people, you know how politicians are, even when they're advising secretaries of state, they tend to not say anything of substance. Or if they say anything of substance, they may come out the next day and contradict it, publicly or privately. But Biden was pretty trustworthy in that respect. So, that's my indication of the positive side of Biden. The negative side goes back a long way. He lets his mouth overload his ass all the time, or vice versa. He's too loquacious. He doesn't know when to stop talking. He had a really bad habit of saying one thing on Monday and another one on Tuesday. That's typical politician. Not so bad as Lindsey Graham or Mitch McConnell. But nonetheless, over 29 years, I guess, he was a little flaky from time to time.
Yes, I think longer than 29 years. His whole entire political career. All right, well, this has been great. Thank you so much. Again, my guest for this show is Lawrence Wilkerson. He was Chief of Staff for Secretary of State Colin Powell, and he's a distinguished adjunct professor of government and public policy at the College of William and Mary. Thanks again so much.
Can I say one more thing about Biden?
Yeah, sure.
If you're going to vote, you vote for Biden because you're voting for the lesser evil. And there's an old philosopher who once said, when you have a choice between evil and a lesser evil, and you have no choice really but to pick the lesser evil, in the aftermath of that decision, don't forget you picked evil.
Are you going to vote for Biden?
I'll have to. I think it's one of the great tragedies of our democracy that we only have the two people we have to vote for.
We really need to have this ranked choice voting like San Francisco and Maine have, where you can actually vote for somebody, and then if that person doesn't come in the top two, then your second choice gets applied for one of those, and that could change everything.
Yes, and we need in that some youth and some vigor and some energy and some diversity, and I'm looking for a really good woman to be president.
I like AOC.
I think women bring something to the decision-making process that men simply don't have. And one of the things they bring, usually, not always, but usually, is an ability to deliberate in a way that men find difficult to do.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think it's really time for a woman, and I hope that that happens in 2024.
Me too.
Thanks again. Really
Sure.
appreciate it.
Take care.